great to have you all here with us in this, the first of our series, A Lenten Journey Through Black History in Rural Ohio. This is a new endeavor on behalf of our office. This was born out of the combined efforts of our Catholic Rural Life Conferences. We have one out in the eastern counties, Brown County, Adams, Highland, Claremont, and then we have another one up in the northern counties. And these Catholic Rural Life Conferences work hard to support rural life farmers and those living in those rural counties, and to make sure that they know the church cares about them too and loves them and is here to support them. And also our anti-racism task force, which works to address the sin of racism and try to work for equity and equality for our African-American brothers and sisters. This is, I said, the first of the series. We have two more parts coming up after this. So if you somehow found out about this one and not the other ones, I'd encourage you to check out our Facebook page or our website, and I'll put those links in the chat in a moment. But we have another session on Thursday, March the 4th, and then a third session on Thursday, March the 11th, the 4th and the 11th. The 4th is on Carthagena, and the 11th is on the Gist community. So it is hopefully a good start to this series, a good start to this Lenten journey. Hopefully you all are off to a good start on your Lenten journey, and we're glad to have all of you here. I want to begin with prayer, and then we'll introduce Professor Sheffield and turn things over to him. So in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Lord, we thank you so much for this beautiful, mild winter evening, and for all the blessings that you put into our lives, all the blessings that you give to us from the moment we wake up until the moment we fall asleep. We thank you for bringing us all together. We recognize tonight all those who have been affected by the pandemic, which maybe is all of us, or certainly most of us in different ways. And it keeps us from being together in person. But we thank you, God, for the gift of this technology that allows us to gather virtually. And we know that your Spirit is with us, even if we cannot be physically together, but your Spirit is with us virtually. We ask that you open our hearts and our minds to your Spirit and to the education that we'll learn today, and also that we can hear from each other and come closer to you and come closer to our history, because we know that, Lord, you help us and want us to know our history and know what brought us to this point, so that we can be better Christians, better brothers and sisters to each other, and better work together to build up your kingdom here in Southwestern Ohio. We pray for this and all of our families and all those who are going without tonight. In your name we pray. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Before I introduce Professor Sheffield, I'd like to ask you, if you are not muted, it looks like most of you are, if you're not muted, please mute yourself. And I'll also ask you to hold all of your questions to the end. If you have any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat box, and I will be happy to share those with Professor Sheffield at the end of his presentation, or when he's done presenting, we'll have a time for questions and for conversation about what he shares with us. So again, please hold any questions until Professor Sheffield is done with his presentation. Ric Sheffield is the Rutkoff Distinguished Teaching Professor at Kenyon College, where he teaches legal studies and sociology. Concurrently, he is the director of the Law and Society and Adams Summer Legal Scholars programs. Before coming to Kenyon, he served for 10 years as an assistant attorney general for the state of Ohio. He began his legal career as a civil rights lawyer, handling primarily sex and race discrimination cases. He subsequently held the position of chief attorney as head of the state's Consumer Protection Division. In addition to research that is focused upon the relationship between law and issues of gender, race, and ethnicity, he has spent several years examining issues involving the African-American experience in rural Ohio. He is among a select group of scholars chosen to participate in the Ohio Humanities Council's Speakers Bureau, lecturing widely on issues of race and law, as well as rural diversity. He has published articles, reviews, and book chapters on topics including legal history, the legal profession, and African American social and legal history. His current project includes completion of a manuscript on voting rights cases from Ohio in the late 1860s and early 1870s. Currently serving as chair of the American Studies Department, he is a graduate of Case Western Reserve University, where he attended college, graduate school in sociology, and law school. He has served upon various statewide policymaking and regulatory boards. During his career at Kenyon, he spent several years on the college's senior staff as associate provost before his return full-time to the faculty. Professor Kenyon, we thank you so much for being here, and I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I appreciate it very much. And also, I want to thank at the outset the diocese, the Archdiocese, for the invitation, for Andrew's work, and all those involved in sort of putting this series together. I have to tell you from the outset, having had the opportunity to travel all over the state of Ohio to give talks about rural diversity, that I'm always heartened when people make the effort, take the time, and hopefully you'll come away from this presentation feeling as though you understand a bit more about rural diversity, as I know my students say that they do. I also want to give notice that this talk is being recorded. It's being recorded primarily because I have students who have classes this evening who cannot attend. And since we're talking about it in class tomorrow, I told them that I would record it. So if you object to that or have concerns about that, feel free to sort of slide on out the back door, and and we'll sort of proceed without you. Let me see if I can get my screen to share with you, and hopefully Andrew will let me know it's up. Is it up? Okay, great. As Andrew mentioned, I've spent numerous years, I'm almost embarrassed to tell you, almost 30 years, nearly 3 decades of researching and writing about and talking about the Black experience in rural Ohio. And some people might suggest somewhat facetiously, well, that's a very short topic, isn't it? No, actually it's not. It's a very lengthy topic, and you'll begin to get a sense of why. And I have to make sure that I can control this. I begin with a single slide. This is a neighbor of mine, and I use neighbor very broadly. I use neighbor to include folks who lived many, many years ago, and he did. In fact, he was a contemporary of my grandfather in the early 19-teens and the early 1920s. And I sort of use him as an example because he's the sort of classic example of an African-American living in this case, Knox County, Ohio, but could be living in any of the rural counties around, who is somewhat unnoticed. And in addition to simply that, I have connections to him because my grandfather worked with him at the local glass factory. I also have a connection because his daughter was my mother's best friend growing up. So I thought I'd give a shout out, although both are now deceased, but there's a connection there. And wait a minute, there's even more connection. There's a connection because her son married my sister. So the connections continue. Back to the story. And of course, every talk should start with a story. So I'm going to share a story with you. I'm one of those strange persons, my children would confirm this, even though they're now in their 30s, who actually likes going to the grocery store. I've always enjoyed going to the grocery store. And in my community, it was the Big Bear, but we'll pretend it's Kroger's if that's the sort of chain that you have. But nonetheless, I would go religiously, no pun intended, to go and shop. And I loved being in the produce aisle in particular. And I can remember one evening being in the grocery store and happened to see out of the corner of my eye an older white gentleman. Well, I started to say watching me. How about staring at me? And before you think that maybe I'm a little paranoid, I noticed this gentleman started stepping closer and closer to me. And I had pretty good peripheral vision. And very soon he was within about 2 or 3 feet of me, staring directly into my face. Now, before you become alarmed, don't worry. I wasn't scared. I've taken martial arts. I knew I could handle myself. And besides, he must have been about 80 years old. I thought I could take him. Nonetheless, this gentleman, as he got closer to me, almost able to reach out and touch me, he looked into my face and he said, "You're not from around here, are you?" Now, I don't know how many of you have been to Mount Vernon, Ohio. And if you have, maybe we could chat about that as well. But there was something about me that convinced this gentleman that I wasn't from around there. I couldn't possibly be from and of his community. And I had to think about it for a second. Now, what was it about me? Oh, I get it. The color of my skin convinced this man not only was I not from around there, but he felt emboldened to sort of either remind or ask me. Now, I have to tell you, and you sort of heard a little bit about my bio, I was a trial lawyer for many years. And so when I was younger, I was pretty quick on my feet. And so at that time, when he asked me the question, I immediately looked at him and said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. What about you?" And he was startled that I would challenge and ask him, this older white gentleman in Mount Vernon, Ohio, if he could possibly be local. And he stammered and stuttered for a couple of minutes, and then he eventually said, "Well, yeah, born and reared here, lived here my whole life, except for I went to the service." And I looked at him and said, "Me too." And then it was clear that there were some lessons to be had. Um, the lessons began, quite frankly, here at Kenyon College and not out into the community. They began because I began to be asked to give guest lectures in my colleagues' classes who were studying about race in American society. And ordinarily, when I would walk into a classroom, I would begin to lecture and then I would stop. And I would deliberately stop and say, "Can everyone see me okay?" And students would nod and they would raise their hand. "Yes, I can see you." I said, "Oh, good, good. I want to make sure you can see me." I said, "You know what? Would someone turn down the lights in this auditorium?" And they would turn down the lights, and it was dark except for the sort of security lights or the safety lights along the edges. And I said, "Can everyone see me okay?" And now they're a little concerned that Kenyon actually hired this man who teaches at this college who's asking these absurd questions about being able to see him. And then after I still had a handful raising their hands indicating they could still see me, I said, "Okay, I tell you what, would everyone please close their eyes? Everyone, close your eyes. And if you want to play along, those of you who are not yet asleep, because a couple of you are already, and I'm only a couple minutes in, but those of you who are not yet asleep, go ahead and close your eyes. Now tell me, can you see me?" Now I have to tell you that there were a couple smart alecks that raised their hand. And yes, I can still see with my eyes closed. And I thought, well, I wasn't saying I was a nightmare, but okay, I get it. When I asked them to open their eyes, when I turned up the lights in the room, I asked them, "Why can't you see me in Mount Vernon, Ohio?" And there was this pause. They were somewhat perplexed that I would sort of ask such a silly question. And I said, "Well, some of you may not know it, but I was born and raised in Mount Vernon, Ohio." Students don't like to be embarrassed, and they were somewhat embarrassed because they didn't want to believe that here I was teaching at this select college in Gambier, Ohio, and indicating that I was from Mount Vernon. And first and foremost, although they weren't bold enough to say it, they wanted to say to me, "Well, you can't be from Mount Vernon." "Why not?" "Well, because there are no Black people in Mount Vernon." "Right. Why do you think there are no Black people? Because you've not seen them? Where have you gone? Have you gone to the AME church? Have you gone to the Baptist church? Have you gone to the social clubs?" And so we began an actual expedition, if you will, out into the local community. And I asked them the question, you know, how do you really come to understand and know the Black community in rural Ohio, like this one to which you've come to be educated? And they very sort of said, "Well, I've driven into Mount Vernon. I've gone to McDonald's a couple of times. Walmart. I mean, maybe I would see some people in Walmart." I said, "Not enough." I said, "Let's start with community. You really have to understand what community is and what it means." And I sort of said to them, you have to also understand that community doesn't necessarily always mean the same thing for Black residents in small town America as it does for white residents. that usually comes as a shock and a surprise to many people. Well, how could it be different? What makes it different? What actually distinguishes the experience of Black people in small town America from white people in a small town? And I said, well, we start with sheer demographics, the small population, the small numbers. And if you don't think that's important, we're going to get to this in a little bit, but think about living in a place, working in a place where few people, sometimes no one else, looks like you. That's an experience that most white people in rural America don't have and can't share. So we begin there, demographics. And the other thing is, we just said it, it's a predominantly white community, which means there are people like you where you feel a part of or don't feel separated from simply by virtue of your race. One and the same time, something else is going on. There's a sense of, and I call it invisibility, going back to the notion of being in the IGA or the Big Bear or the Walmart, and people not recognizing that there are, in fact, Black people in the community in which they are. That we are, for the most part, regardless of our numbers, whether it is 2 or a dozen or 50, relatively invisible. In fact, I suspect that some of you on this talk today live in communities where maybe your neighbors, maybe yourself, maybe family members will say, well, I'm kind of embarrassed to say it, but we don't have any Black people here. Any Black people here. Wrong. I'm going to tell you you're wrong. I haven't been to every one of your communities, but I know you're wrong because I happen to know, based upon my research, that Black people either currently live or have lived in every small community in the state of Ohio. We'll return to that, of course. Now, I mentioned to you invisibility. That's one of the things that distinguishes Black people from white people. And it seems strange that I'm suggesting to you that I stood out to this man in the grocery store, not because I was invisible to him, but I stood out to him because, well, I was hyper visible to him. At one and the same time, I can be both invisible. Gee, we don't have any of them in our town. I can't really tell you because I don't think I've ever seen them here. And yet at the same time, I assure you that if I go into Mount Vernon and I walk down Main Street, if I walk into a supermarket, if I walk into Walmart, everybody notices me, whether I want to be noticed or not. Hypervisibility. As one person said to me that I interviewed, he said, you know, it's like I'm on a stage all the time, even when I don't feel like performing. So how do we come to know and understand what this Black community in rural Ohio is and what it's all about? And I said, as any good storyteller would say, come along with me. Let's check this out. You want to know something about Black folks in small town America? Do you really? Start with family. You can't know anything about Black folks in small town America unless you understand how important family is and has been for generations. This is neighbors of mine, the Booker family, Viola, George, and Joseph Booker. Now, again, I have to admit, I tend to pull out historical pictures because I like historical pictures a lot. And sadly, the three of them have now passed. But they're a good representative of the types of families that lived in Knox County, Ohio. Not just families, but also people who have prospered and done rather significant things, not just at the local level, but the statewide level, and sometimes in the region. You want to know something about Black folks in small town America? Understand something about family names. Those of you who study anything about migration understand that people come and go for different reasons, but when Black people come into small town rural America, they oftentimes are joining kinfolk, folks who have come before them. This is fairly common in ethnic communities. Those of you who live in Cleveland know that there's a Little Italy or there might be various Eastern European neighborhoods on the west side. But this whole notion of migration is very common, and people go for a reason. And when it comes, for the most part, for Black folks in rural America, they oftentimes are joining kinfolk. And by the way, you need to appreciate that when I say kinfolk, I'm not always talking about blood relatives. That when my grandmother, in fact, moved and migrated up to Knox County, Ohio, she used to live with, I heard these stories about, she lived with Aunt Becky. And I was trying to sort of, do the genealogy. We don't have anybody named Becky in our family. Well, no, we didn't as a blood relative, but Aunt Becky had a boarding house. And many Black folks migrating into Knox County, Ohio, eventually ended up staying with Aunt Becky. And she, of course, was Aunt Becky to everyone. Names like Turner and Simmons and Newsom and Bird and Rouse and on and on and on. These are the names that if you came into my little town, you say that name to any Black person, they'll say, oh, I knew them. Because as you all know, living in rural America, families and names, that's what it's all about. It's the Simmons family. Simmons family, I take great pride in. They're not my blood relatives, but they're my family. They're my cultural and racial family in predominantly white rural Knox County, Ohio. And one of the reasons I like to claim them is that Samuel Simmons, sitting in the front row with his wife next to him and his children, was the first Black graduate of Mount Vernon High School in the 1880s. And while I think that is particularly significant, what's even more significant is that all of his children graduated from Mount Vernon High School. Second generation high school graduates. Now, those of you who are historians know that that wasn't very common in the 1800s for even white men to graduate from high school, because in rural areas in particular, many were needed to go out onto the farm and engage in farm labor. And so therefore, completing their high school degree was not necessarily very common. But hold it, the Simmonses not only graduated from high school, second generation high school graduates, but went on to college. In fact, Harry Simmons, the young man in the middle, in the back, went on to Oberlin College and got a college degree. Oh, wait a minute. He went on to medical school, as did his sister to his right, to our left, who went on to nursing school. This was the most prominent and accomplished African American family in our community, and I suspect it probably would hold a candle to about any other Black small town American in a lot of places. Well, that is Harry Simmons, class of 1901, Mount Vernon High School. What do you notice about his class? Look around that picture. Oh, I get it. He's the only one. You want to know about the experience of Black folks in small town America? You have to understand and appreciate isolation. That much of your life is spent and lived by yourself. In classes, on teams, in other sorts of activities and events, you're by yourself. And as I mentioned, Harry Simmons went on to graduate from Mount Vernon High School, getting his diploma, going on to college. And sadly, when he was in medical school, he was in an accident and was killed. Now, the other thing about small town America, especially for African Americans, is that these family bonds really link residents from small town to small town. For example, although my family eventually migrated up to Knox County, Ohio, we have so many relatives in Zanesville, West Kingdom County, Cambridge, Guernsey County, Coshocton. And if you know any of these small towns, you get it. They're all very similar. A couple have slightly larger populations of African Americans, but you get the sense that if in fact you go to some of these communities and you say the name Fisher or Edwards, people nod their heads. Yeah, I get it. And those are my kinfolk. Those are the folks. Oh, sorry, I think I have the wrong slide. Well, not really, because if you know anything about people of color, particularly African Americans and rural America, you understand they've always been a part of a mixed race group of people. This is the Bird family. And the Bird family was Black, white, and Indian. And the Bird family became one of the first mixed race families to settle in Knox County, Ohio, and still has descendants here to this day. Do you really, really want to know something about Black folks in small town America? You got to know something about the church. I'm sorry, folks. You have to understand how important the Black church has been, not just for sustenance of the soul, but for almost every other conceivable aspect of life for Black folks in small town America. Now, I'm not talking about mega churches, by the way. I'm talking about small congregations, going way back to almost the time within probably half a century or so, the founding of the county. The first African American church developed in Knox County, Ohio, was developed in 1870. And 1870 is a very significant year. And we might sort of talk about that a bit, but appreciate that the Wayman Chapel AME Church, represented by the women on the left, was the first Black church. And on the right is the Mount Calvary Baptist Church. That's the church in which I was baptized. And in fact, if I zoomed in, you'd see my mother in the back in the choir, and you'd see my grandmother in the choir, and you'd see, well, kinfolk all around. Black church, as I mentioned before, Black church is really important because in those days, especially in the early years, the early 1900s, for example, when the Baptist church is being founded, they also had mutual aid societies. If in fact folks were down on their luck, imagine what happened in 1929 when the Great Depression came around. How did people survive? How did they make it? And oftentimes they couldn't survive with the help, the assistance of the churches. Now I had to that's my grandfather in the middle with the the little pocket square. I always sort of slip in pictures of my family because I get a chance to go around and give these talks all over the place, and it just makes me smile. So you'll have to put up with it. This is part of the congregation of the Mount Calvary Baptist Church. If you had come to Mount Vernon, Ohio, despite the fact that people will tell you we don't have any, I don't remember seeing any. If you had gone to South Mulberry Street on a Sunday, this was what you would see. Members of the congregation standing out in front of the church in their Sunday finest, to and fro. That would be your experience in our small town. Pastors, oh my goodness, there's a Negro pastor for a white congregation. And if you get into the article a little bit, oh, his name is Sheffield, Reverend Samuel, that's my grandfather. And the interesting thing wasn't so much that my grandfather, in fact, I've had several of my family who were in the clergy, who were evangelists. But in this particular case, he became the pastor of an all-white congregation in Tiverton, Ohio. You need to understand the experiences of Black folks. They talk about isolation. Imagine my grandfather ministering to this all-white congregation. Folks, do you really, really, really want to know something about Black folks in small town America? You have to understand something about the work. How do they make their livelihoods? What did they do? Now you can't see it, but in the large cylinder on the left, in the very back, there's a circle drawn around the head of the man in the far back. I'm going to tell you right now, he's Black, and he's there because there were Black men in all of the factories, usually at unskilled labor positions, usually as janitors or doing some of the more dangerous jobs. But when we were there, we would shout it out, not necessarily orally, but we would have pictures and we would draw circles around so that people know that we were part of that experience as well. Now, what else did Black folks in small town America do? Well, that's part of the story of American society. That not only did some of the migrants coming into Mount Vernon come in the company of white folks as servants, domestic servants, but many of the Black folks living in my small town ended up, in fact, oftentimes the only jobs they could get were as domestics, cooks, cleaners, and janitors. And I could tell you stories, legions of stories about my family as maids and butlers and drivers and laundresses and the like. But I tell you for a fact that Black folks in small town America would not have survived but for the opportunity to at least work as domestics. And in fact, most Black women could not get any other employment in these small communities. What else did Black folks do in rural America? They farmed. Oh my goodness, did they farm? Now, by the way, I'm not talking about agribusiness. If you're confused, if you're sitting there thinking, well, how many thousands or tens of thousands of acres and how many, no. I'm talking about small family farms. I'm talking about plots. That's important. It's really important to the story. And people talk about, were there Black folks in rural America? Yeah. In fact, this is another Mr. Simmons, not in the same family, but he had a garbage hauling business. And when he wasn't out there working very hard to sort of support his family, he was also taking kids on rides. My mother used to tell me stories about the hay rides that they would have when she was growing up. And they would put some bales of hay in the back of his wagons and they'd drink hot cocoa and circle the square in downtown Mount Vernon. As I mentioned, we also got jobs as laborers and oftentimes had some of the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs in those factories. This was at Cooper Industries in Mount Vernon. In fact, the gentleman on the right sadly had a workplace accident and was killed in one of the foundries. This is Mr. Newsom in my community. I'm talking about working now, folks. And you look at him and you say, oh, he's got, looks like a lab coat on. And you're right, that is a lab coat. But you need to understand the story about him eventually wearing a lab coat. Mr. Newsom, who was born and raised in Mount Vernon, Ohio. His father was a Methodist minister who in fact lived right across the street from my family. In fact, his father is the one that performed the ceremonies, the wedding ceremonies of both of my mother's sisters. Mr. Newsom, reared in Mount Vernon, graduated from the high school, went off to the service. He served in World War II. He came back, and some of you have heard of the GI Bill. You know, that GI Bill that allowed men to go on to college who otherwise would not have had the opportunity. Here's Mr. Newsom. He went on to college. He went to Central State University, one of Ohio's historically Black colleges and universities. And he got a degree and he got a teaching certificate. And here he was qualified to teach. And when he arrived back in his hometown of Mount Vernon, Ohio, he promptly applied for a job, teaching job. And sadly, we don't have any jobs available for you, Gib. But he needed a job badly. And they said, but we do have a janitorial job open. And so Mr. Newsom spent several years as the janitor in the Mount Vernon High School until right before school began in the fall. Lo and behold, the industrial arts teacher resigned. Immediately, the school was in a lurch. What do we do? And they said, well, I think Gib kind of has that background. And he did. And he became the first Black teacher in Mount Vernon in 1964. Folks, do you really, I mean, seriously, do you really want to know something about small town Black folks? You have to understand, yes, absolutely, families are important. Church is essential. And yeah, work, can't get by without it, but you need to understand that's not all that Black folks in small town America did. That wasn't all that they were about. They had social lives. Whether it was Kid Jackson, shown in the previous slide, whether it was musical groups, whether it was theatrical productions. Notice this building here that suggests that the Colored Women's Glee Club was putting on an operetta called In India, 1921, 35 cents. I don't know what you can get for 35 cents today, but I'm letting you know you can get a pretty amazing theatrical performance in 1921 put on by the Colored Women's Glee Club. And now, I have to admit to you, born and raised in Mount Vernon, Ohio, I didn't even know there was a Colored Women's Glee Club, let alone that they were putting on theatrical productions of that time. And as I learned and studied more about it, I realized and actually found photographs from that theatrical production in 1921. And someone said to me, "Oh, we're back to your Indian theme again." And I said, "Well, don't forget that many of the people living in my community were, in fact, part native. So it didn't surprise me at all that this would be one of the choices that they made in their production." Social life, music was really important to Black folks in small town America, and particularly important to this family, the Snowden family. Snowden family, in fact, were contemporaries of someone that some of you may have heard, Daniel Decatur Emmett. Dan Emmett, purportedly the author of a particular song called Dixie. And I say purportedly only because these gentlemen were, in fact, from the Carolinas. These gentlemen were, in fact, living in the areas where the song speaks of. And Dan Emmett had never been there before. In fact, my colleagues, Howard Sachs and Judy Sachs, have written a book about the so-called Confederate anthem and what the real true origin of that song might be. Now, you can imagine in a small town like mine, where you're not supposed to ruffle feathers, and a town that took great pride in its local son, who purportedly was the author of Dixie, not many people liked the fact that this book came out and made a pretty convincing, compelling case about the origins of that song. But that's an aside. What was it like to go to school for Black children, going way back into the 1800s again? Oh, wait a minute, two. We went up from one. Oh, sorry, they're sisters. Oh, well, we got close. But something else was happening. We did see, again, time and time again, one, sometimes two people in these various school organizations and groups and what have you. But this is what I want to show you. In 1926, the class of 1926, most of you, I would assume, who have attended high school, have a high school yearbook or have seen a high school yearbook. And I assume that most of you know that yearbooks are usually, in terms of the students, alphabetized. Yes? It makes sense? If you want to find someone, you go to the alphabet, you go to the C's, you go to the J's, what have you. Look what we have here. We have Davises and Whites and Birds and Williams and Mayos, all on the same page of the high school yearbook. Now, Mount Vernon was too small to have segregated schools. When I went to elementary school, there were 5 Black children in my elementary school. My 3 siblings, my brother, my 2 sisters, me, and my cousin. And I assure you, they were not going to build a school for the 5 of us. So there was no segregated school. But lo and behold, in the yearbook of our high school, they did segregate Black children. They put them all on the same page, as if they were not deserving to be listed and shown in another way. Now, I've had students and young folks kind of get confused. They look and they say, are these guys waiters? Or, I don't quite recognize the aprons on the front. And I say, well, you probably also don't know much nowadays about secret societies, at least what they were calling in those days, secret societies. You know them better as, in this case, the Masonic Order. And what you may not know or appreciate in that small town America, if you wanted to be a Mason and you were Black, you'd have to join the colored Masonic Order, because none of the white Mason organizations would allow Black members. And when I've given this talk in other communities, I've been challenged by, oh, that's not true. I'm sure that we must have at some point had a colored person in that. And you know what? I'm willing to say there might have been one in a community someplace on this planet. But I can tell you, based upon my research, it wasn't happening in Knox County, Ohio. And not only was it not happening for the Masons, but it didn't happen for the Knights of Pythias, or the Oddfellows, or the Elks, or even the American Legion, because these organizations remained segregated, many of them all the way through the 70s. And some would say to you to this day, still segregated. Now, these clubs and organizations were, of course, for Black men. But something else happened when I talk about social life in 1930. Some of you, I hope, know the name Marion Anderson. Some people say Marion Anderson may have been the finest contralto ever among classical and opera singers in this country. And lo and behold, she came to Little Mount Vernon, Ohio, and performed at the Memorial Theater in 1930. She was sponsored by the Booker T. Washington Club. What in the world was the Booker T? Oh, it was one of those colored women's clubs that seemed to have existed in many communities, even the smallest of communities in Ohio. Clubs like the House of Ruth, the Phyllis Wheatley Club, 20th Century Club, Colored Garden Clubs. Black women were extremely active, very much engaged, and trying to sort of provide opportunities for their sons and daughters and their spouses. And by the way, we also had colored chapters of the Red Cross and the Eastern Star. And that's because Black women were not permitted to join either group. During the First World War, when the Red Cross put out a call, come and volunteer, we need help for the war effort. When Black women in my small town showed up, we're really sorry, but we can't let you join the organization. You'll have to come up with your own colored chapter. Sporting life, yeah, Kid Jackson was a great bare knuckles boxer. Around the turn of the century, and I have to be careful now because I mean the other turn of the century. Young kids today think I'm talking about, from 1999 to 2000. No, I'm talking about, from 1899 to 1900. Yeah, sporting life was really big in small town America. In fact, some of you have heard of the Negro Leagues, I'm sure. And if you look on the front of these jerseys, these are the Mount Vernon Giants, our own all-colored baseball team that played and performed, and to the extent possible, were able to get games. In fact, in interviewing a gentleman from my community, he said, "Son, don't you know the story?" I said, "No, sir, I don't. Tell it to me." He said, "Have you ever heard of Satchel Paige?" I said, "Yes, sir, I have." He said, "He pitched right down the street." That the great so-called Negro pitcher, one of maybe the greatest of all time, was a barnstormer. And they'd load up their buses and they'd travel around the country, picking up as many games as they possibly could. Professional baseballers. And here in my little town, I never knew that we had an all-colored baseball team named the Mount Vernon Giants. And as I did more research, I discovered, wait a minute, there was another colored baseball team just down the road from me in Coshocton, Ohio. And lo and behold, the man in the middle holding the bats, that's my father. And he played for one of the all-colored baseball teams. Social life. Now, this may seem strange to you. I have this newspaper clipping about a Miss Ohio contest. You need to know the full name. It was called Miss Bronze Ohio. That's because Black women were not permitted to participate in the pageants that were available and open to white women. So in the state of Ohio, sponsored by the Ohio State News, the Negro newspaper from Columbus, Ohio, there was a statewide beauty pageant. And I put this here, I thought I was putting it here because I knew someone who was in the pageant from Mount Vernon, Ohio. And then as I read more closely, I realized those 5 women at the top, they were all from Mount Vernon, Ohio, in a statewide beauty pageant. By the way, they're all sisters. And one of those sisters happened to be a classmate of my mother, who also twisted my mother's arm to also participate in the pageant. And I discovered among the more than 100 and some women who were in this pageant, 11 were from small little Mount Vernon, Ohio, in the statewide pageant. Social life, what do Black folks do? Well, we also like to go to the movies. And way down at the end of there, you're going to see the Vernon Shine Theater. That was the only movie theater in Little Mount Vernon, Ohio, frequented oftentimes by everyone in town who could afford the 10 cents. Obviously, it got a little more expensive as time went along, but I can recall when it was only 10 cents to go to the theater. Now, I love this picture in part because when I talk about isolation, and you look at all those people going to the theater, lined up, excited. Oh, wait a minute, there's a little girl in the front. That's my sister. And my sister's experience when she would go on to the theater was oftentimes being the only one in the theater, unless, of course, her siblings and cousins went along. Now, before you start to think that I'm making all this up, and you wonder what's going on, and I can tell you stories about certain sections in the theater where the colored children sat, and I can tell you about going to the swimming pools and interviewing people who told me about the times that when they went to swim, they were told, these young Black children, oh geez, now we have to drain the pool and clean it before we let white kids swim. So at the end of the month, we'll let those Black kids come in, they'll swim, and then we'll drain it all out, we'll clean it up, and then we'll let white kids come in and swim. And I remember an older gentleman calling me. I gave this talk in Mount Vernon, and he was beside himself. He called me and said, that's not true, it's not true. My wife worked at the community pool in Mount Vernon. That never happened. And I said, well, remember, I've interviewed people, some of whom were in their 90s, talking about are you trying to tell me your wife was there every day, all the time, going into the locker room with children and was able to witness whether or not they were treated fairly or unfairly? And then, of course, as I did a little more research around Ohio, I began to find stories like this, whether in Portsmouth or Ironton, about the same issue. The local community pools not allowing Black children to swim. And I came across a really strange story about Zanesville, Ohio, where in fact a wealthy Black man donated money to build a swimming pool, and they still segregated it, having the Black children swim on one side of the pool while the white children swam on the other side. And I thought, don't they understand how water works? That you couldn't quite keep the water from moving from side to side, but you need to appreciate whether it's Hillsburg or Chillicothe or Zanesville, these communities all have these sorts of histories. Well, what are we going to do? We need to understand. I said, I want you to understand something about families. I want you to understand about church, about social life. You need to understand something about migration. As I mentioned, Black folks have moved into these communities. And how do I know that? Because unless you are indigenous, you were not here before the migrants. Home ownership. Black folks, particularly those during the Great Migration, moving up into Ohio from the South, had oftentimes for the very first time the opportunity to own their own homes. Absolutely incredible. Regardless of how hard you worked, that was a very difficult thing to accomplish down south. And yet coming to rural Ohio, that was one of the first things, and such a point of pride for Black families living in small town Ohio. I mentioned farming. Again, many of us were subsistence farmers. We weren't agribusinesses, but boy, we sure could, in my family, we called it putting up the vegetables. You know what I mean? Canning. I mean, I realize some of you don't understand small town lingo, but we called it putting it up. We're going to put up some beans. We're going to put up some corn. Subsistence farmers. And I have to tell you, in my own family, in 1929, when the Great Depression hit, that's what saved us. We had gardens and we had fruit trees, and we never went hungry. And I can tell you, when those men came to our back door, and I realize younger folks have no idea what I'm talking about. They used to call them, well, somewhat pejoratively, hobos. They'd ride the trains looking for work. They would jump on, ride, and they would come to the back of our farm, and they would knock on the door hat in hand and say, I will work can you spare me a piece of bread? I didn't say a sandwich. I didn't say a loaf of bread. Can you spare me a piece of bread and I will work for you? And invariably, my grandmother would look to one of us and she would say, go to the cellar. And we would come back with a jar. And it didn't matter what the jar was. It could have been beans, it could have been corn, it could have been cherries, it could have been berries. It didn't matter. And we would invariably give them that jar. And they would look at us like we were crazy. The whole jar? Yeah, you can have that jar. But my grandmother always said, on one condition, you bring me the jar back because I need the jar. And I have to tell you, they always did. And they washed it out. They cleaned that jar and they brought it back. And they would almost every time they came through, stop at our place. And sometimes I have to admit, when they offered to fix the wobbly fence, we could see them out there pushing it a little bit to make it a little wobblier so that they would have a job to do. People came to our small town in the company of white people to serve. Migration, there were families that were in fact brought up from the South who were no longer slaves, but called servants from time to time. And those factory jobs, as I mentioned before, they were dirty jobs and they were dangerous jobs. But they were jobs because these people were working for wages. Remember folks who had lived much of their lives never receiving any wages, and here they were having those opportunities. Migration, what else brought Black folks to small town America? Most white folks in small town America don't understand or appreciate this, but when Black men went off to war, World War I and World War II, they saw a different world. They would invariably come back to those small towns and they would say, do you know I was allowed to eat in a restaurant with white people? Do you know that I could go to any movie, any place that my money could carry me? And they had those experiences. And by the way, speaking of experiences, you probably can't see it very well on your screen, but look in the front row and look at all the rows behind them. All of the officers were white. These are segregated army units. Black men were not considered to be good enough to command units, so they always had white officers. But you know what? Black men felt compelled to prove their patriotism. And so you will find in every small town where there are Black veterans, they are participating in VFW, they're participating in American Legion, and they're part of the color guards. You go to the parades, you're going to see that one guy. He's there because showing patriotism was absolutely essential to Black men to show that we belonged and we deserved our rights. And that's what you see at the top left. Colored Guard, Mount Vernon, Ohio. And it was, in fact, a colored guard. It was the all-Black American Legion post that also assembled and marched in every parade in Mount Vernon. And by the way, on the lower left, that's my family. That's my grandmother, that's my uncle, that's my other uncle, and that's my father. And again, I told you, I'm shameless. I have to keep sticking them in there because this represents the sort of community that we have gathered over time. So what's the story all about? I'm saying to you, do you really want to know something about small town Black folks? We did too. And almost 3 decades ago, I took a group of Kenyon students, the American Studies Senior Seminar, out into the local community to do just that. And what we realized from the outset was this is about partnership building. This is about finding a way to reach out and say, not only do we think that your story is worth telling to all of our community, not just for Black people, to our entire community, but we also want to be partners with you. We don't want to come out and just exploit you. What can we do for you? And that was essential, that when you go out to the community, you ask people to give of themselves, you must also find out what is it that would do the most good for that community. And almost to a person, they said, help us reclaim our past. People don't know, people don't remember, people don't believe that we were here, that we had been here. And so my students said, let's start telling the story. So we went out and we collected artifacts, we collected photographs, we interviewed as many people as we could doing oral histories. And then we built a museum exhibit. We went to Columbus, Ohio, to what was then called the Ohio Historical Center there, off the freeway in Columbus. And they taught us how to build museum exhibits. And my students went back into the workshop and they were showing us how to construct these things and how to put the type on and how to put the photographs on. And we went away having, went back to our various studios at Kenyon, and we built 6 of these pylons, 6-foot high pylons that told essentially what I just said to you. If you want to know about Black folks in small town America, understand about their families and their church and their social life and their work and their migration, why they came. And we did that. And we decided this is something that needs to be shared with our entire community. Again, not just the Black community. Because if you live in rural America, you know there is no such thing. The Black community cannot exist but for and with the white community. And I'd like to say the white community can't exist without us either, but it's going to take much longer for them to admit to that. So what we said was, let's have a celebration. So what you see is our museum exhibit that's in the public library. We figured we're going to invite everybody in town to come and join us. We also had another one at the Historical Society and a couple of other venues. And then what you saw is a party. We basically called it a community party. We want to invite the entire community out to see this exhibit because these are your neighbors. And it's important to understand and realize that these are your neighbors. These are the folks you went to school with, you work with, you played with in your neighborhoods. And they showed up, Black folks and white folks, coming to see our exhibits in the various venues. And invariably, they would look and they would point and they'd say, that's my uncle. Or that's, I went to school with. We played on the same ball team. And you could see their faces lighting up as they became more and more excited with recognition. And we were delighted that they found that kind of delight. As I said, this was a party. And I have to admit, Kenyon students know how to party, but we had a party. This is Todd, the young man with a bow tie on. Todd was from suburban Minnesota. Todd was a history major at Kenyon College. Todd was in that class of our senior seminar, along with the young woman to his left. I'll talk about her in a second. Todd, when he decided to enroll in the class, and we were sort of interviewing the students to find out, well, what's your interest? Why do you want to take this class? And Todd said, Professor Sheffield, I have to be honest with you. I don't know anything about the Black community. I can't even tell you for sure if we had Black people in my suburb in Minnesota. And I said, Todd, you're going to find out that you did have Black people in your suburb in Minnesota. Here's Todd actually telling the story to local Black residents about their past, stories that they had not known. He took such great pride in having participated in a project of this type. And I can still recall the emails he sent me long after he graduated, saying to me, you know, Professor, that may have been the most meaningful thing I had done in 4 years of college. Now, I can't overlook the young woman to his left. That's Tamara Parson. Tamara was, well, a Mount Vernon, Ohio resident. She went to Mount Vernon High School. And when Tamara and her partner, and we sort of pair them up 2 by 2. It starts to sound like a biblical story. If I say in 2 by 2, they start, but that's what we did. We sent everyone out into the community 2 by 2. And they sent in the offices of a school official asking the question, because part of our project to study the community is to understand as many of the institutions of the community as we could. And the educational institution is an important one. for the same reason that I tell you, I take great pride in that a Black man graduated from my high school in the 1880s. And so Tamara, having graduated from that same high school, went to the school official and sat with her partner. And when they asked the question, what can you tell us about Black children in the local school system? His response to them, almost a knee-jerk response, was, why in the world would you want to know about such an insignificant group? That was his response. When she came back to class, to our seminar, and we're sitting around a seminar table, and she and her partner are sharing with us that experience. And I got to tell you, all of us around that table, tears were rolling down our cheeks as she told us how hurt she was that this man, this official of her school system, could say that she and people like her were not even important enough to study. I have to tell you, several of my students that night said, that's it. We're doing this project and they had a renewed sense of purpose. They had a commitment to that community. And I have to tell you, it made a big difference. So here's Todd, as I said, Mr. Professor, I'm not sure I can do anything for this group. And yeah, he's telling the story. In addition to creating the museum exhibit, we also did a booklet that we had in those old days. Sadly, we didn't have scanners, so we had to Xerox a lot of the pages. So it wasn't the most delicate or elegant product, but we wanted to give something to everyone in the community. And so when we got a grant to have these things copied or produced, we made them available at no cost to anyone and everyone who wanted them. They were at the public libraries, they were at the schools. All you had to do is ask for one. And we had people writing from states around the country. I grew up there, or my family's from there. Could I please get one? As we got a little more sophisticated, and with the advent of digitization, we created a website. We started putting a lot of these images up so that people could, in fact, visit our work product and learn about these families. And we had a dateline, a history dateline, timeline. They talked about way back in 1808, the first Black man living in Knox County, Ohio. Now, you Ohioans know, I mean, when was Ohio? 1803, right? Black folks have been in rural Ohio since the very beginning. You need to understand that. You need to make sure that your community and your neighbors know that. We have been there from the very beginning. In fact, in 1877, some of you may know that name, Frederick Douglass came and lectured in Mount Vernon, Ohio. Now, having grown up and gone to school in Mount Vernon, I would have loved to have known that. It would have given me such great pride. Not known, not discovered until my students went out to the community, started reading newspapers, started reading the history, and started gathering the information to tell the story. Now, I'm going to stop here, and I'm stopping here because, well, sorry, that's my grandfather. Leaning against his car on South Main Street in Mount Vernon, Ohio. And anyone who's ever driven through Mount Vernon know that junction, Ohio 229, the Kenyon students know, that's how you get out there to Gambier, up on the hill. We've been there. We've been there for generations. For generations. I guess I didn't stop there, did I? Because I wanted to show you that at one of those parties, one of those celebrations, a woman came up to me and she said, Professor Sheffield, I'd like to give you this baseball glove. It was my father's, and he played for the Mount Vernon Giants. And since you're doing this history, it just makes sense to me that you would have it. And I was touched. I was touched by the offer, but I said to her, Now, I'd like you to keep it in your family. If you let me take a photograph, that'll be enough so that people know that, yes, your father was here. They did that sort of work. This is Mr. Booker. He was one of the gentlemen that I interviewed. I believe he was in his 80s. I don't think he had yet turned 90 when I interviewed him. His brother was on the Mount Vernon Giants, and he told me I'm going to watch the ball team play. Here's where I think I'm ending, almost, because you know I could go on about this for the next 5 or 6 hours. So, but I'm not going to, I promise. I saw people starting to click off and they're leaving, but this is what I want to say to you. And I say this to my students all the time. When you engage in a community engaged project like this, you don't do it for yourself. You don't do it for a grade. You don't do it for bragging points. You do it because you created a relationship and a partnership with people who live in a community, who deserve to be acknowledged, who deserve to have their stories told. And I just told you about a story that's almost 3 decades old. And yet, if you look up at the top of this, you'll see that this occurred, just last year, 2020? I think there's somewhere a date on it. The theatrical production was being produced in Mount Vernon, Ohio, Raisin in the Sun. And they asked us if we would allow them to bring our museum exhibit to the theater to be on display. And when I sent an email out to my former students saying, hey, guess what? You know that project you worked on 30 years ago? It still lives. It lives not just in the hearts and the minds of the partners, many of whom are now long gone, that you celebrated, but in the community that continues to honor those people. That's the story that I really want to tell. Now I have to thank you because you let me go on much longer than I was supposed to. I know Andrew was about to cut me off. He kept, giving me the sign, Sheffield, you're talking too much, talking too long. And I realized we lost most of our audience, but I'm going to stop there. Thank you all for your patience, your kindness, for having me at least be a part of this amazing series. And I guess, as I understand it, Andrew is maybe going to moderate a couple of chat things, questions, and I'll fumble through it.
Professor Sheffield, thank you so much. This was so wonderful to hear. I admittedly, I mentioned this when we were talking earlier, I'm not from this area, so I knew none of this, but to hear this story and know that this story is not unique to Ohio, it's around our country of this, as you put it, this invisible population that continued to thrive and to be proud of their community and to have their life, even if those around them were not as excited to have them there or didn't even know they were there, to know what they did and how they lived. And to be honest, it doesn't sound like their lives were so much different than others' lives. They just had to do it in a different way, in a way that society didn't like, but they were proud of themselves and proud of their culture and their family and their work, and they did it and loved it well. And I think this is just a great presentation and a great eye-opening for a lot of folks. So I really do appreciate your willingness to be here with us and to share your research and your passion for this topic.
Well, thank you very much. The invitation is greatly appreciated. And now folks can go back to their lives and get snacks or watch their favorite shows on TV and do something interesting. But wake those people up that are in the room with you that fell asleep just
Well, you all are certainly welcome to take your leave, but if you have any questions, any thing you want to put in the chat box, or just raise your hand and speak out, that would be fine, just to kind of hear anything else that you maybe wanted to get some more information on from Professor Sheffield. There's a question here. It says, have you ever had conversations with Jim Lowen of Sundown Towns?
I have not had conversations with Jim Lowen. I've read some of the postings. I think Jim Lowen has had a website for a number of years and has done research, extensive research all over the country about sundown towns. And I was very interested because I've been informed about a few in Ohio. In fact, in some places where I've been invited to speak. So it was intriguing to me that the community would invite me to come to speak. Places where Black people were told, don't let the sun go down while you're here.
Mm.
Yeah, Martha.
I just wanted to point out to Dr. Sheffield that just after you finished, there were 55 people in this group, and that was 10 more than when you started.
Wow. Well, I was actually opening my door, calling people in. So
We are very glad that we had such a great turnout for this evening. You'll notice in the chat, I put a couple of links. One is to the Facebook collection of the events, and the second is to the events page for our office where you can see those events posted. So if you somehow found out about this one and don't know about the other two, you can click on either one of those links and find the information and the links for those next two events on the 4th and the 11th. Dan, you had a question.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, what was the impact of the Great Migration on a place like Mount Vernon? I mean, I'm very aware of what Great Migration meant in the larger Ohio cities, but what about in a place like Mount Vernon? How much did it increase the population of African Americans, and did it disrupt the social structures that had existed in the sense of new people coming in?
I'm delighted you asked the question. One is you have to remember there wasn't a single Great Migration. There were multiple great migrations. Certainly during the Reconstruction era, certainly during or after World War I or around that time, and also after World War II. But yes, it did impact, I think, in very significant ways in rural Ohio in particular, and certainly the rural Midwest, I would say. But one of the reasons I say in significant ways is that people tend to talk almost exclusively about Chicago or about Cleveland or about Pittsburgh. And what you don't always appreciate is that many folks who migrated up from the South lived very agrarian lives. They did agriculture. They didn't necessarily want to live in crowded cities. They liked being able to breathe the air as opposed to the fumes from the automobiles and the like. So, and as I mentioned before, one of the reasons to migrate to rural Ohio is the opportunity to have a plot of land. And most people know you're not going to starve if you have a plot of land, especially, if it's a good land that you can grow garden on or have some fruit trees. And that's exactly what my family did, is that we moved into rural Ohio and we had chickens, and I hate feeding those chickens, but that's another story. And we were able to get through the Great Depression because of that plot of land.
Thanks for that question, and thanks, Dr. Sheffield. Any other questions from anybody? Any other things to say other than, obviously we've seen a couple of messages of gratitude over in the chat. If you want to check those out, but obviously we're all very appreciative of what you've shared with us. So before we close up shop, any other last comments or questions?
I have a question. I was just wondering, was the experience in rural America a lot different than living in a city? You mentioned that, people were able to survive by what they could grow, but did that really help people to have a better life, or were the opportunities about the same?
No, the opportunities were not the same. In fact, I would say they're probably not in any way whatsoever. They were very difficult for Black folks, whether you were going to urban areas or rural areas. Why? Because of racism. Racism has plagued American society almost from the very beginning. And it is manifested in different ways, rural versus urban. And as colleagues have said, some of you probably have said to each other, well, we don't really have a race problem in our little town because, well, we don't have any of those people here. And that always makes me, sorry, sister, I'm talk about. That always makes me nervous because I don't know if they're saying we don't have race problems because if they were here, we would have them, or they're just simply saying nobody's around and therefore we don't think about it much. The reality is that Black folks have always suffered discrimination in communities, large and small, whether it's residential segregation, as was very common in every urban area. You all know you can go to certain cities and you go to the Black side of town or don't cross the railroad tracks. It happened sometimes in rural areas, but not nearly as much. In my hometown in Knox County, Ohio, Black people live on the east side and the west side and the north side and the south side. We don't have one side of town. It doesn't work like that. So the experiences, I think, are quite different. They're different in terms of congestion, in terms of those of us who are small town and country. And my students always chuckle and laugh at me because I'm country in that sense. When I walk around on my campus, I have a tendency to say hi to everybody. Because when you're small town, that's what you do. When you encounter another human being, you acknowledge their humanity and you say hi. Those big city students of mine, why is this person saying, I don't know who that person is? And they get really worried, suspicious. Well, because in urban areas, you don't say hi to everybody. In fact, you probably are asking for trouble if you start to do that. So imagine Black folks coming who, one, want to be accepted, want to be liked by neighbors, trying, also to sort of at least acknowledge or say hello. If you're in a social environment, a cultural environment where you're not supposed to speak, or you're supposed to speak with deference, or you're supposed to, lots of adjustment issues take place. And in fact, I'm just finishing a book right now about living Black in rural Ohio.
I would just like to, just a couple of comments. His response to me about sister was before you all came on, we were talking and I was sharing in a small rural town up in the northern part of of Ohio. I brought up the issue of racism and the group silenced me right away and said, why are we talking about that? We don't have any here. And so I raised the question, why do you think that is? And it opened up a whole different conversation. But the other thing, your whole invisible comment really meant something to me because many years ago, we had a boarding school in Brown County, Ohio, and we had day students and boarding students from all over the place. And one year we did a Christmas concert with the local public school, and our area happened to be very Catholic. So most of the kids in the school are Catholic, as were their family, of course. But we had an African-American girl whose father was a jazz musician, and she was a pianist for us for a couple of the songs in the concert. And after one of the rehearsals, she came to me in the dormitory that night, and she said, "Sister, you wouldn't believe what just happened after the practice." I said, "What?" And she said, "This boy came up to me and he said to me, 'You're the first live Black person I've ever seen. Can I touch your hair?'" Which we all know is not a no-no, but she was laughing and she was like in disbelief that she was the first actual live Black person that they had seen in that community. So
And
your comment about disability is so true.
Well, I was just saying, how many folks on this talk have actually had that experience who live in rural Ohio? There are people who live in my county who have probably never really truly been in the company of a Black person. Other than looking across the store in Kmart or something, that might be the only Black person they've ever seen in person and not as a part of popular culture, one of those TV movie things that somehow suggests that that's what real life is all about.
Mr. Sheffield, someone wanted to go back to one of the previous questions about the different great migrations, the multiple migrations, and what kind of impact that had. I don't know if there's a universal answer to this. What kind of impact that had on the culture of the community, how that would influence, the social life, the family life, the work life, when you had different folks migrating from different parts of the country.
Well, I think folks in urban areas will tell you right off the bat that oftentimes the response to diversity is conflict, competition for jobs, competition for housing. In rural America, that didn't happen as frequently. You didn't have the numbers. I mean, there wasn't an issue of, gee, if more Black people move here, they're going to take up all the houses. No, not really. That never happened. If more Black people here, they're going to take all of the jobs. No, that never happened. So in rural areas, you saw much less of that sort of competition taking place. But at the same time, you also need to appreciate there are periods, even in Mount Vernon's history, in Knox County's history, especially during times of labor strife, where they used Black folks that they would bring up from the South as strike breakers. Mount Vernon's factories, in fact, brought Black people to Mount Vernon specifically to defeat the unionizers. So imagine what that does in terms of relationships with local workers. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's difficult enough to accept these people who are so different from us, but now we know they're coming in here to actually jeopardize our jobs. So that wasn't a great period in the history of this particular community.
There's also a question. You talked in your presentation about farming and how most of the farms were much smaller, family subsistence farming. Was that kind of the rule, or were there some farmers that did actually have larger crops? And what kind of crops were typical of that land?
I have a project that I had a student who started last year looking at Black farmers in Ohio. It's a really important topic, and some of you probably know something about how the U.S. Department of Agriculture denied Black farmers some of the subsidies that were available to keep white family farmers going. And so as a consequence, the demise of the family farm has been a problematic issue throughout Ohio, but especially for Black farmers who basically were unable to sort of sustain. So I had a student last year who actually went out and interviewed some of the few remaining Black farmers. Agribusinesses, absolutely not, Andrew. These are not big concerns. And in fact, oftentimes, I can't think of an exception where they didn't hold other jobs. In order to keep their farms, they had to work in the factory, they had to get some other job, and then they'd come back and do the farm work in the evenings or on the weekends. And at the top, right now, I can't think of an exception to that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, as we are nearing 8:30, I would like to echo Pam put in the chat, a blessing to you, Professor Sheffield, and for your presentation, for the sharing of your family, your neighbors, the community, and all the research and the work that you and your students have done. I can't imagine any of us here didn't learn something, and some of us, like me, learned a whole lot. So it's a great blessing to have been here with you and to been able to hear what you shared. So thank you again so much for coming and starting off this series so well for us. Again, I invite everyone to join us for our second talk next Thursday, the 4th, on Carthagena. And then our third talk will be on Thursday, March 11th, on the Gist communities down in Highland and Brown counties.